And so much is up in the air. MP and doctor Dan Poulter switches from Tory to Labour. Who knows if Humza Yousaf will be in charge in Scotland by the end of the week. Downing Street says it can stop the boats, but Robert Jenrick, who quit government, reckons he's got a better plan. And one of America's most famous politicians, Nancy Pelosi, tells us why democracy itself is in danger. Morning. Reunited in the studio with us this morning, Chris Philp, the Home Office Minister, and Labour's Wes Streeting, after this moment a bit earlier this week.
Are they then going to be sent to Rwanda if they came here on a crossing?
From
Congo? Yeah.
Would people be sent from... Well, I mean, Rwanda is a different country of Congo, isn't it? It's a different country.
Yes. It is. Yes. Definitely. You're saying if they come from a war zone in Congo, would they then be sent?
Now, Chris, I have to ask you, what was really going on there? Did you really not know, or was it one of those moments of live television?
Well, you can probably tell from that clip I was struggling a little bit to hear the question. And when I put that point to him, I was asking that as a clearly rhetorical question rather than a substantive question, as I think any fair-minded listener would conclude. OK, and Wes Streeting, I have to ask you, do you practice that eye roll and side eye in the mirror? Because it was pretty impressive.
It was either side eye or jaw-dropping moment. I was quite dumbstruck by the whole moment, but
OK, well, hopefully
Chris says it was a rhetorical question. I'll believe Chris.
Well, we will talk to both of you later in the programme about some of the serious points behind that moment on Question Time earlier in the week. The Lib Dem leader, Ed Davey, is with us too this morning ahead of the local elections. And with me throughout at our giant election desk, Robert Jenrick, the Conservative former Immigration Minister, Baroness Chakrabarti, the Labour peer, and the former SNP leader in Westminster, Ian Blackford. A busy time in Scotland too. Let's start, as we always do then, with what's making the news today. The Observer splashes with the defection of Dan Poulter. You'll hear our interview with him in a few minutes' time. That makes the front page of the Sunday Telegraph too. They say it stirred up Tory rebels. And they feature Robert Jenrick's plan for a cap on immigration. More of that later. The Mirror says smuggling gangs are holding migrants in World War II bunkers before they cross the Channel. And the Express has Keir Starmer saying Labour would keep the pensions triple lock if it wins the election. They also have an interview with Rishi Sunak, who's today refused to deny an election could be in the summer. Although his expectation, he said, that it will be later in the year. You three, good morning, welcome. Let's start then with this defection. It's very rare that this happens, Robert. How damaging do you think it is to your boss, Rishi Sunak?
Well, I thought it was a very confused resignation. Dan is wrong on the facts. When he came to Parliament in 2010, the government was spending about £130 billion a year on the NHS. Since then, under a Conservative government, there's been a 40% real terms increase in spending. So the suggestion that Conservatives don't care about public services, the disadvantaged or the NHS is just plain wrong.
But politically it's damaging though, isn't it? I mean, defections are something that give a symbol of things going badly wrong.
Well, it's always a shame to lose colleagues. People do that for a range of reasons, personal ones, sometimes it's opportunism. But I think the argument that he's making is just clearly incorrect.
Okay.
The issue for the NHS today is not about spending more money, it's about reform, it's about increasing productivity, delivering better quality of service to the general public.
OK, and his point is very clear. He doesn't think that's happening. But Shami, it's a gift to Labour, isn't it, this?
Yeah, but I also want to say that Dan's been on my radar for a little while because I remember being in common cause with him during the pandemic when he was a co-signatory to a campaign for the so-called TRIPS waiver that would have allowed vaccine patents to be temporarily lifted so that the global south could vaccinate more quickly. So I think he's an internationalist. He also, in his piece today, as well as speaking up for the beloved NHS, he speaks up against what he sees as nationalism in the British Conservative Party. He's obviously a more internationalist person, and I think I share values with him.
It's interesting you say that, because he clearly thinks that the Conservative Party has changed. But do you believe that Labour will be able to get more Conservatives before the general election coming across to you?
I think it's perfectly possible. Certainly from the common cause I've been making with senior Conservatives in the House of Lords over, for example, Rwanda. I have to believe that there are others in the British Conservative Party who feel that their tradition is being ignored.
OK, and we'll come to Rwanda. We'll talk to both of you about that later in the show. Ian, a huge week in Scotland, real turmoil. Hamza Yousaf, in case you've been living under a rock, his job as First Minister is on the line. Who's in more trouble, the Tories or the SNP?
I think the SNP will get through this week. The First Minister has obviously gone out and made that offer to speak to other party leaders. I think it's important to remember in Scotland that we have a PR system in our Parliament. It's very difficult to achieve a majority. It's a Parliament of minorities. What we need to do is recognise the challenges that we face on climate change, get the economy going, and we've got a First Minister that will set out his agenda, make sure that we can build common cause, make sure that he wins that vote this week. OK,
well, we will see what happens. We'll talk about that in more detail later in the programme. Let's hear then why, in his own words, Dr Dan Poulter has done that rare thing and defect. He's quit the Conservatives to join the Labour Party.
Well, I've been thinking about it for a little while, and it was alongside my work as an MP. I still work as an NHS doctor and always have done. The health service that I saw under huge strain is very different to the health service of maybe a decade ago. And the struggles and the challenges that patients have been experiencing in accessing timely, good care was something that really resonated with me and stayed with me. And I found it increasingly difficult to look my NHS colleagues in the eye, my patients in the eye, and my constituents in the eye with good conscience. And I feel that the NHS deserves better than it has at the moment in terms of how it's run and governed.
But you pin that on then the government's handling of the health service, because of course the NHS has had lots of problems for a long time. It's run by managers in all sorts of places, but you pin that on the Conservatives' handling of it.
I think it comes from that. I think it comes from values as well. Very clearly, it's been the case in the last 8-10 years or so. The NHS is not a priority to the Conservative Party and to the government. And if we want to do better for patients, we want to restore that service to where it was before, then I believe that we need to look to a party that has a track record when it was in government before under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, that has a track record of delivering for patients, transforming services, getting on top of waiting lists, investing in community health care. And that's what Keir Starmer and the Labour Party I know will do, and they will be trusted, I'm sure, to do it by NHS staff as well.
But when you have, as a Conservative, you've previously said that Labour had been profligate and inefficient at how it ran the NHS. You've attacked Labour's record of running the NHS in Wales.
I mean, I think certainly, the NHS in all parts of the country, be it in Scotland or Wales or in England, is under pressure. But the service that I saw during those night shifts was unrecognisable from the service that I worked in routinely before I became an MP. Frankly, patients deserve better. It shouldn't be the case that people, a third of patients are waiting more than 60 days for urgent cancer care. That shouldn't be the case in a civilised health system.
How would you describe the broader change in the Conservative Party?
We now have a Tory party that resembles sometimes a little bit more a nationalist or national party rather than a party of the centre-right. And I feel that actually the changes that the Labour Party has made since 2019 under Keir Starmer, not just on the health service, but particularly on that offer on health about tackling the determinants of poor health, housing, poverty, and all those issues, are the sort of things that are really going to make a big difference. And I think that's why I believe that, why I've made the change I have and why I believe it will make a difference to the patients I look after.
Since 2010, though, constituents in your Suffolk home have chosen you, sent you to Westminster as a Conservative. Some of them might be angry that you have left the party that they chose. What do you say to them?
Well, I had two things I could have done. I could have carried on to the election and then stood down, or I could have decided to potentially there could be a by-election and call a by-election, but we're at the point where there might be a general election called at any moment. And I think Rishi Sunak should call a general election tomorrow or as soon as possible and let the public choose, make a choice about who should be in government. And I thought about it and I thought, well, what's the best thing or the right thing to do? And on balance, I thought because there will be an election very, very soon, that it didn't make sense to have a by-election. I thought on balance it was better to continue to work diligently for my constituents through until the end of this Parliament, be that in a few weeks or potentially a few months.
OK, Dan, thank you so much indeed for speaking to us today. Thank
Pleasure.
you. Well, let's talk to the Home Office Minister, Chris Philp, about that. Great to have you with us. Thank you for coming in. Dan Poulter's assessment of the Conservative Party is a damning one. He says you've become a nationalist party, you've lost your compassion. It's a sign of real rot, isn't it, that he's done this?
Well, I don't accept what Dan is saying at all. He talked about the NHS as a priority. Well, of course, the NHS was one of only 2 departments that was protected during those years of necessary spending restraint after the last Labour government bankrupted the country. As we heard earlier, we're now spending £165 billion a year on the NHS. That's more than ever at any point in history. It's a 13% increase above inflation just over the last 4 or 5 years alone. In just the last year, the NHS has hired an extra 68,000 people, of whom 7,000 are doctors. That's a net increase. And there are 21,000 more nurses today than there were a year ago. That isn't a sign of a party deprioritising the NHS. That is a sign of a political party, the Conservatives, investing heavily in our NHS because it is a priority.
But as Conservatives themselves would very often say, it's not just about the money. What Dan Poulter is saying is it's also about values. And he is saying that the Conservative Party now is not the Conservative Party he joined in 2010, that it's lost its compassion and it doesn't value public services in the way he thinks he ought to. And he also told me he believes some of his now former Tory colleagues share his views.
Well, I just don't accept that. Look, I'm police minister and I work closely with police every day of the week. If you ask any police officer or chief constable who I've met or dealt with, they will say the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister and I hugely value the sacrifice they're making working for the public. The same is true of workers in the NHS, school teachers and so on.
Don't you think every teacher, everyone in the NHS, every police officer would say they feel the Conservative government values what they do?
Well, I would hope they do, because we do value what they do, and that's why we're investing, as I say, record amounts of money in both education and health. It's why we've got record numbers of police officers. And on your question about results, we've obviously gone through a very difficult pandemic. We've had unprecedented strikes in the NHS, and despite those challenges, waiting lists are now reducing. They've come down by...
They have been at a record level.
I think you would, in fairness, Laura, acknowledge that was due to COVID and the strikes. They are now coming down. They've been coming down in a sustained way for the last 5 months by 200,000. Now, contrast that with Labour's record in Wales, where tens of thousands of people in Wales are fleeing the Welsh NHS under Labour to get treated in England, and the proportion of the Welsh population suffering, hang on, let me finish, very long waits, and on Welsh NHS waiting lists under Labour, those proportions are higher than in England. So I don't know why Dan thinks joining the Labour Party is a good idea when their track record in office in Wales on the NHS is terrible.
Well, he's been very clear he's doing it because of what he has seen as a doctor with his own eyes. But with a defection, it's not just about the statistics and who's right and who's wrong on the particular case. Doesn't it betray a wider situation here, that you have a Conservative MP who says, enough, I fancy the other party, I have no faith in this party anymore. You have about 70 Conservative MPs who've already said they're standing down, obviously not all for political reasons, some for personal reasons, but that is a huge number. And isn't it mirrored by the fact that polls have consistently shown for months voters are walking away from you too?
Well, look, I think clearly the opinion polls are where they are. We can all see what they currently say. But I think as we continue to deliver and get things done, the public will appreciate that. So, yeah, we've seen inflation falling dramatically down to 3%, wages rising at 6%. So for, I think, 9 months now, wages are rising faster than inflation. Those NHS waiting lists are coming down. Last year, the small boat crossings dropped by a third compared to the previous year. We've just committed to 2.5% of GDP expenditure on defence, a radical programme of welfare reform.
Buying it, and Rishi Sunak has done numerous resets, refreshes, relaunches, whatever you call it. Nothing seems to be working for you.
Well, I think as we get closer to an election, most likely in the autumn, it becomes more of a choice rather than a sort of referendum on do you feel grumpy with the government. And clearly at the moment people do feel grumpy with the government. But as we get closer to an election, it's not so much a referendum on grumpiness, it becomes actually a choice. Who do you want to run the country? Rishi Sunak, who's got a plan that's working, or Keir Starmer, who has no plan whatsoever and wanted to make Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister just a few years ago. And I think confronted with that choice, we will see our poll ratings significantly improve.
We'll see. let's talk about one of those plans. Now, the government finally got its latest round of immigration legislation, the Rwanda plan, through Parliament this week. On Question Time this week, despite your moment at the top, there was a serious question behind that incident. A member of the audience wanted to know if family members came to the UK from Goma, a city on Congo's border with Rwanda, could they theoretically be sent back to Rwanda where they might be in danger? Now, you said some people wouldn't be deported if there was clearly a risk that they would be harmed. But doesn't that illustrate precisely the problem with this bill that Robert Jenrick and others identify, is that there will be exceptions, and because there will be exceptions, it'll end up getting gummed up in the courts. It simply will not work.
Well, there's a few points to make. I mean, the first is that I would say to anyone who is in France, whether they're from Congo or indeed from anywhere else, and by the way, the numbers crossing on small boats from Congo are tiny, but anyone in northern France or Germany or anywhere else in Europe thinking about getting on the small boat, whatever your nationality, Congolese or otherwise, just please don't do it. It is dangerous, it is illegal, and it is unnecessary because France and Germany and Belgium, they are safe countries. You don't need to leave France to seek safety. So that is the overwhelmingly important point. These journeys should not be getting made at all in the first place. And that's why the Rwanda plan is such an important part of our overall plan to stop the boats. Secondly, there is the safety mechanism that you've referenced. There's a clause in the bill that talks about serious and irreversible harm. That is a very, very high bar to be used only in exceptional circumstances. But on the sort of specific question about whether someone of Congolese background would have a problem in Rwanda, there's no reason to believe they will, but there is a monitoring committee that will carefully examine those an independent monitoring committee that will carefully examine those kind of questions in case a problem ever does arise. But there's no reason today to believe that there will be. Robert
Jenrick and others will argue this week that Parliament should put a cap on migrant numbers. Are they wrong?
Well, I think that's talking about legal migration. So we are committed to substantially reducing legal migration. We don't think it's right to have large-scale, low-skill migration. We want a much smaller number of high-skilled migrants.
Should you have a cap then?
Well, I'm not in a position to sit here and sort of advocate for a hard cap today. But what I can say is that we're taking measures that have been enacted and are now being implemented to reduce legal migration by about 300,000 a year. That's by significantly increasing salary thresholds. It's by reducing the numbers of dependents who can come in with migrants. I think the British public do want us to significantly reduce migration, both legal migration as well as stop illegal migration. We've got 9 million people of working age in the UK who are not working. We've got over 1 million people on unemployment benefit, although that is, of course, as a percentage, half what it was under Labour. So I'd like to see us prioritising getting those people into work, not importing labour in very large quantities.
OK, Chris Philp, it's great to have you with us in the studio. Thank you for coming in. I know there'll be a lot of argument and debate about that subject in the next few days. Well, what do you think? You know, we always love to hear your views. You know, sometimes we ask your questions. Let us know what's on your mind. Email kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk. On social media, you can use the hashtag #BBCLauraK. And if we have time, we'll share some of your comments later in the show or in our Thursday newsletter. And you can sign up to that. The details are on the screen. Well, Dan Poulter's defection is, of course, a big boon for the Labour Party, especially in the run-up to the local election this week and the general elections. Well, who knows, but maybe soon. Wes Streeting is Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, and he's here with us again today. It's good to have you with us.
Good morning.
Did Labour offer any future baubles to Dan Poulter to get him to defect?
Dan's been very clear he's going back to the NHS full-time. He's not standing for Parliament at the next election. This idea that he's just abandoning the sinking Conservative ship to save himself is nonsense. He's abandoned the Conservative Party to save the NHS. And I think there are millions of Conservative voters across the country who are feeling politically homeless, who can see the chaos and the failure to deliver of now 5 Conservative Prime Ministers, who are now looking for an alternative. And I hope they will trust the doctor, who has seen the Conservative Party up close in Parliament and also the Change Labour Party up close in Parliament. And I hope they will give Change a chance at the next general election by following Dan Poulter, backing Labour, so that we can get our NHS back on its feet and fit for the future, sort out our economy and give Britain its future back.
And obviously this is something I'm sure you're going to use it in campaigning in the months to come. But did Labour offer him anything in return for him coming across? Did you offer him a place in the House of Lords, perhaps?
Not that I'm aware of. He's said very clearly to me when I was talking to him this week about how he might help. He's going back to the NHS full-time when Parliament is dissolved, which can't come soon enough as far as we're concerned. And look, I want to draw on his expertise. He's a really frontline clinician with years of experience in mental health. We are committed to having mental health reform in the first King's Speech, because the Mental Health Act is woefully out of date. We've got 40,000 young people waiting more than 2 years for treatment, and I want to make sure that Mental Health Act reform that Labour government will bring in hits the front line in a positive way as soon as possible, as well as the mental health support in every school and community mental health hubs in every community.
Just on the specifics, though, of this decision that he's made, you say you're not aware that there were any offers made to him. Can you rule that out, that there were any offers made to him?
Well, I'm not aware. No, he's certainly not mentioned anything to me, and neither has the Labour Party.
Okay. And has the Labour Party carried out the same kind of due diligence on Dan Poulter than they would have any other new Labour MP or candidate coming aboard?
Well, he's not a Labour candidate at the next general election. He's been a Member of Parliament now for 14 years. He still works in the NHS wherever he can. He's going back to the NHS when this Parliament comes to an end. And I think it's a sign of both the state of the Conservative Party, but also the strength of the Labour Party, that we're attracting someone like Dan Poulter over to the Labour benches before the general election arrives. And I hope that sends a signal to those disaffected Conservatives who are looking for a political home that they're welcome to join us in Labour, because we want to unite our country. The challenges are so great. We've got to bring our country back together to tackle the state of our economy, the state of our public services, and the threats in this really dangerous and volatile world that we find ourselves in.
But politics is, though, very tribal to many people. It's often something they feel in their gut. And he's the second Conservative, after Christian Wakeford in 2022, who's come across with the Labour Party. You're voting with the Tories in Edinburgh to try to sink the SNP government. I mean, some Labour members, some Labour voters watching might think, oh, it's all a bit cosy, isn't it? They're not quite comfortable with it.
Well, firstly, I don't agree with your characterisation of Scottish Labour's position in relation to the Scottish Government. Of course, we've got no confidence in the First Minister of Scotland. Of course, we've got no confidence in this SNP government. Look at the chaos and division. It is like, you know, from my vantage point in Westminster, remarkable parallels between the implosion of the SNP and the state of the Tories. But also, we want to build a big tent. We want to make sure that people in this country who are looking for a party that's serious about turning Britain's challenges around, to know that they can come in. Because if we win the next election, yes, we've set out a big agenda on the NHS, this week on transport, Keir Starmer's commitment to protect the triple lock today in pensions. But when it comes to tackling the big challenges, we've got to see government, business and civil society working together. So it's great that we've got Richard Walker, the chairman of Iceland, former Conservative, saying back Labour for business. It's great that we've got Nick Bowles, who advised David Cameron on preparation for government, saying, look, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are a serious team with answers to the country. We want to build that big tent.
You mentioned the triple lock there, which is the promise to pensioners that their benefits will always go up in line with inflation. Keir Starmer, and you were making the commitment today that you would keep that if you win the election, except just a couple of weeks ago, you were still saying, oh, well, you'd have to see what state the economy was in before you make that decision. It's just politics, isn't it? Well, unless something dramatic has happened to the economy in the last couple of weeks, since you were saying that you want to reveal to the nation this morning.
Well, I think the fundamental reason why Keir Starmer set out to give pensioners that reassurance was Rishi Sunak's claim that he will scrap national insurance, creating a £46 billion hole in the public finances. He hasn't ruled out a cut to the state pension. He hasn't ruled out cuts to the NHS, and he hasn't ruled out rise in income tax.
Politics.
And we want to give pensioners that reassurance to know that they will get certainty with Labour. We will protect the triple lock. It's currently built into the government baseline, but this is a Conservative party that's saying they're going to scrap national insurance, create a £46 billion black hole without saying how they'll pay for it.
They're saying over time they would like to phase out national insurance.
You and I both know that if we said something like this, you would be hauling us over the coals, and every broadcaster should hold them over the coals.
It's a question we have asked of them, but the Conservatives say you're characterising something in a way that they would not accept, and they're not here to answer that question. But I want to ask you finally about immigration, because we're going to talk about it in a few minutes' time. There is a move being suggested by some Conservatives to bring back the idea of capping legal immigration at a certain level. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think there are two things, aren't there? We've spent a lot of time talking about illegal migration, the boats, and then there's net migration, which I think objectively people agree is too high. If you want to bring down net migration, you need a serious plan to do it over time, and I'm going to make a contribution to that in the National Health Service. We've always been an international employer in the NHS. That's a good thing, but we definitely have an over-reliance, and we're actually taking people from countries like Nepal, which have chronic shortages of their own. We're turning away straight A students from studying medicine at university in this country. I think that's immoral in the case of countries like Nepal. I think it's unfair in the case of homegrown talent. So we're going to grow that homegrown talent, make sure that we build our own domestic workforce instead of constantly looking to pull the immigration lever, often with immoral consequences in terms of where we're poaching staff from. I think that's a serious approach to bring down net migration in the longer term. I think what we're getting is a lot of gimmicks because people are jockeying for position in the Conservative Party amidst all of this chaos. But we do need to bring net migration down. We do need to tackle illegal migration. And Yvette Cooper, she's got a serious plan, not the sort of headline-grabbing gimmicks we've seen from the Tories.
And we do need to end it there. At West Streeting, it's always great to have you with us. Now, our viewers will want me to remind you, they want to see and hear about your detailed plan for social care. So whenever that is back and ready, do bring it to us here on Sunday. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Well, as we have mentioned, the Scottish First Minister, Humza Yousaf, could face 2 no-confidence votes next week, one in his own leadership and one is in his own government after he dumped his coalition partners, the Greens. To hang on, he either needs them to get them back on side, unlikely, or win the support of ALBA, the small independence party that just happens to be led by Alex Salmond, who used to be the SNP leader, who we were hoping to join just then, but he's been slightly delayed, so we will talk to him in a few minutes' time. First of all, let's talk to our panel and we'll focus on immigration, which we were raising with our guests. Now, Robert Jenrick, you were Immigration Minister. Our viewers heard you quit over the Rwanda plan, but you now want to look at legal migration and put a cap on numbers. Why?
Well, I quit over the Rwanda bill because I didn't think it was strong enough. But the bigger issue to me is legal migration, because the number of people coming into this country is so great that it has an even larger impact on the general public. And I think that for the last 30 years, politicians of all political stripes have made promises to control and to reduce the levels of legal migration, only to do the opposite. And in fact, in the last 25 years, the number of people coming into this country has been 100 times higher than the number that had come in the 25 years prior to that. And I think that level of unplanned legal migration is putting immense pressure on housing, on public services, on community cohesion. And as we argue in the report that we're publishing, it hasn't made us richer. In fact, for the last 2 years, GDP per capita has been falling. And the argument that I make is that the only way to end this, once and for all, is to set a cap, which is a lock set by Parliament with proper forecasts, a real democratic debate that ensures that these sorts of broken promises never happen again.
The problem with that, though, is that your former colleagues had a cap. It wasn't a legal cap in Parliament, but they had a target of getting immigration under 100,000. And it didn't happen. So why on earth now would people believe that this would happen, this would make any difference? And also, on the economy, lots of business people have sat in this studio and said they absolutely need immigration. They couldn't cope without legal migration.
Well, I'd answer each of those questions in turn. Firstly, the cap is necessary to do exactly as you say, which is to restore a degree of trust. The public are rightly furious that politicians have broken their promises. I think the Conservative Party, like other political parties, has little credibility on this issue. Only by having a parliamentary lock can the public trust that is actually going to happen. And that enables Parliament to debate exactly the sorts of trade-offs that you're referring to, whether it's for the health service or for the economy. But I don't think that this level of predominantly low-skilled migration has made us richer. I think it's contributed to our low productivity in recent years because businesses have lent on the lever of low-skilled migration rather than investing in skills, in training, in technology, the things that genuinely drive our country forward and improve the wealth of citizens of this country rather than just bringing people from overseas.
OK, let's talk about the other side of this then. Illegal migration, as the government would call it in the Rwanda bill. Now,
so I would call it asylum seeking, protected by the Refugee Convention.
Well, you've been writing about just these things, the play between migration and human rights, and you believe actually actually people should be defending human rights law. Tell us about it.
So I have a book on Thursday called Human Rights, the Case for the Defence, and I'm almost amazed that nearly a quarter of the way into the 21st century we need a debate like that, because human rights have been denigrated by people across the political spectrum, and immigration and the toxification of the debate about immigration has been part of that. Now, desperate people in boats ought to have safer routes to the UK. That is my view. But what has happened, I think, with the stunt that is the Rwanda bill, is that it's not really about stopping the boats. It's about stopping the courts. It's about having a debate that basically leads Mr. Sunak and his chums to say at the next general election, let's pull out of the Court of Human Rights.
Do you think that's the plan?
I think that's the plan. I think the plan, the Rwanda bill defenestrates the domestic courts. So as Chris Phillips said, you know, it'll be very, very hard for an asylum seeker to get any redress before British courts. So their lawyers will be duty bound to pursue claims in the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, at which point Mr. Sunak can say, this is a foreign court, not an international court, and therefore we should pull out.
And we're going to talk about Scotland in a second, but Robert, you were in the Home Office when this plan was conceived. Is that right? Is that what this is about?
No, this is about securing our borders, which I think is incredibly important. I think it needs to be stronger. I do actually support leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, because I think although it had noble intentions when it was created in the aftermath of the Second World War to protect Europe from fascism, it's been twisted out of all recognition, and now you're seeing activist judges in Strasbourg who view this as a living instrument, taking decisions that are best placed for Parliament and for politicians. You saw this very vividly this month.
They've protected British people from abuses of power by their own governments on occasion, and they've certainly protected people all over the Council of Europe. There are currently interim measures in relation to Putin's Russia, preventing Ukrainian prisoners of war being executed.
Why wouldn't you trust British judges and the British Parliament to make these
British
decisions?
Judges have no jurisdiction over Ukraine and Russia.
There's always been rights in this country, long before the European Convention on Human Rights. But I want these decisions to be made in the UK. I don't think, for example, it's a good idea that net zero.
What we need to do is have a whole programme about this and have you two in the studio to talk it through for 60 minutes, because it's fascinating to hear you both agree about things don't work,
we'll take you up on that.
But from very different perspectives. We must talk about Scotland. Now, Ian Blackford, you were the leader of the SNP in Westminster. The SNP is in a lot of trouble in Edinburgh. Humza Yousaf, the First Minister's job, is hanging by a thread. Now, there are two options if people haven't been following this. Either he can get back the Green Party, who he had a huge fallout with, to back him, or he can talk to Alex Salmond's party, Alaba, the small pro-independence group. Which is it going to be? Because if he can't do either, he's toast.
We've had a very successful period working together with the Green Party through the Butte House Agreement over the course of the last 3 years or so. And of course, that has come to an end. I want to this morning appeal to our friends, our colleagues in the Green Party to recognise where we are. We are colleagues together in arguing for independence for Scotland. We've pushed through legislation where there's been mutual support. For example, we've taken 100,000 young people out of poverty with the child payment. I would ask them to think very carefully ahead of this week of the values that we both have and about making sure that we can deliver that stable government, supporting the First Minister. I apologise for what has happened this week. It could have happened in a different way, but we are where we are. But the choice that every member of the Scottish Parliament has this week is, are we going to support that government under Humza Yousaf to make sure that we deliver the legislation that we all agree on, to make sure that we've got the focus, if I may say so.
That's very notable, though. So you were a very senior figure in the SNP this morning. You are apologising to the Greens and saying, please come back.
You know, I think we could have handled this in a different way, and I'm sure the First Minister would say that as well.
Well, he hasn't apologised.
Well, he's apologised for the hurt that Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater feel. Think very carefully about where we are today. Think about the obligation that we have to get to our climate reduction targets for 2045, things we can work together. I would say to them today, don't throw that away this week. Show your faith and trust in the First Minister. We are where we are, but we can make sure that this government can deliver on the priorities of the people of Scotland if we make sure that Humza Yousaf remains our First Minister.
And can you see a scenario where Humza Yousaf could pick up the phone to Alex Salmond and do a deal?
Humza Yousaf has written a letter to the party leaders in Holyrood and that's who you'll be speaking with. You know,
because for our viewers who aren't familiar with this, Alex Salmondis doesn't sit in the Scottish Parliament at the moment. Could you see a situation where Humza Yousaf...
That won't be happening.
It won't be happening.
What we're talking about is Humza putting forward the priorities of the SNP government and seeing where we can have common cause. Let's think about the interest of the public in all of this. Because we have this two-stage system, first past the post members and list members, the Scottish Parliament is a party of minorities. Let's think about the responsibilities that we all have collectively to deliver for the interests of the people of Scotland.
OK, very interesting indeed to hear where you hope this will all end up. All three of you, thank you so much indeed for now. Let's think then about the local elections that are coming thick and fast. They're happening this Thursday in England. There are other elections for police and crime commissioners in Wales too. Last year, the Lib Dems had a bumper outing at those polls. They won hundreds of seats and gained 12 councils. Now, the Lib Dems love nothing more than a photo op. There's Ed Davey, the leader, with, I think that is a sand timer, an hourglass, with time running out for the Conservatives, they claim. I'm pleased to say Ed Davey is back with us in the studio this morning on this very, very busy morning for news. Let's start just where we were at with Scotland. If this all collapses for the SNP, would your party go into coalition again with Labour?
Well, we're looking forward to Scottish parliamentary elections. We think they should be held. We think the SNP has failed Scotland. If you look at the NHS in particular, but also police and schools, basic services are vital for Scottish people. The SNP has got a dreadful record. They're so obsessed. Their ideological obsession with independence has meant they've not focused on the basics. And
but
that's why we think...
coalition with Labour?
Well, first of all, we need that Scottish parliamentary election. And Liberal Democrats are arguing for that very, very hard. Alex Cole-Hamilton, our leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats in the Holyrood Parliament, has been a big advocate of that. And he's making it clear today that the First Minister wrote and wanted talks in Boot House with all the opposition parties. Alex has made it clear that we can't join those talks.
You won't be joining those talks?
No, we won't be. And there's a good reason for that. I'm afraid the SNP have put the national interests of Scotland behind their own partisan interests, and therefore we don't think there's anything that we can discuss with the SNP. We fundamentally disagree with them on the constitutional question, and their governance on domestic issues like the health service has been so poor. So that's why Alex is clear. We're not going to go into those talks. We want a Scottish parliamentary election.
But if in that election it looks like Labour and the Lib Dems could form a coalition to have a majority in the Parliament, would the Lib Dems consider working with Labour again?
Well, first of all, I think we have to fight elections, Laura. You're always keen.
It's an important question of principle, though, because coalitions haven't always worked out that well for the Liberal Democrats before. But the Scottish Parliament is set up to encourage coalitions. Would you, on principle, if you get to that point, work with Labour again?
Well, I'm not going to prejudge the election which has not even been called, and I'm certainly not going to prejudge what Alex Cole-Hamilton and the Scottish Liberal Democrats will do. What I will say is you're right on one level that the Scottish Parliament enjoys PR, which means it's a much fairer system. It means their votes count, and that has led to Liberal Democrats being in government in the past and doing some great things on things like the health service and the environment.
Well, let's talk about the health service. So today you're announcing you want everybody over 70 or with a serious health condition to have the right to have their own GP, a named GP, to use the jargon. With respect, I've heard politicians make that promise on a lot of occasions. How would you do it with no extra money? And is it really feasible in the NHS in 2024?
Well, it's really important that people do have a named doctor, particularly if they're over 70 or have got a lifelong condition. All the evidence shows it improves their health outcomes. It actually saves the NHS money because people don't go into hospital so often. So it's a really sensible policy. You're right, others have promised it before, Jeremy Hunt did, but I'm afraid what they implemented was a sort of tick box exercise. It's not been implemented. So many people complain they don't see the same GP. And so the way to deliver it is to have many more GPs. What we have been saying in the Liberal Democrats for some time now, and we've worked with health experts on this, we need 8,000 more GPs. You can't deliver that overnight. We reckon it would take at least 4 years. It would cost an extra £1 billion every year for those 4 years.
And where would that money come from?
Well, we've said that the tax cuts that the Conservatives have given to the big banks since 2015, they should be reversed. That's worth £4 billion a year, so not just pays for this part of our policy to get more GPs, so you can get a named GP, but for many other parts of our health and care policy.
And GPs working now, though, who already exist and are in practice, rejected the government's new contract for them, saying it didn't provide enough new funding. If you want to get more GPs in future, would you, as Liberal Democrats, say that GPs right now should get more cash?
Well, yes. I mean, what's happening, the settlement for GPs this year is, I think it's less than 2%. And that means when I go around in the local elections talking to people campaigning, meeting GPs, they say that they may have to lay off members of staff because the amount of money that the government are putting forward is way too little. That means this situation, which is dire at the moment, is going to get worse under the Conservatives. So that's why Liberal Democrats in the local election campaign have put the health service and care right at the front, along with what we've been saying on sewage and crime.
And quick prediction, was a good night for you on Thursday?
Oh, I think we're going to make really a lot of the net gains. I think we could do well in places like Wokingham, in Tunbridge Wells, in Elmbridge, and maybe in places like Dorset.
Give us a number.
We never give a number, you know that. But I'm looking forward to a good night for us.
OK, Davy, thanks. It's always great to have you here with
Thank
us
you.
in the studio. We'll see what happens in those elections on Thursday. Well, as we've been talking about and as we mentioned earlier, we are now going to speak to Alex Salmond, the leader of the pro-independence Alba Party. He could hold Humza Yousaf's fate in his hands this week in a vote of no confidence in the Holyrood Parliament. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning, Mr Salmond. What's your price for supporting Humza Yousaf, getting him out of the hole?
Well, we're in sunny Aberdeenshire here, as you see, so hopefully we can put some sunlight into Scottish politics. I mean, Ash Regan, who leads Alba in the Scottish Parliament, is obviously in a highly influential position, given the political arithmetic. She will be meeting with Humza Yousaf at his invitation. She'll take with her some very reasonable, positive proposals, which hopefully, if the First Minister accepts them, will help him to get out of a very tight political corner.
Ian Blackford, the former SNP leader this morning, has told us pretty clearly it's not going to happen. There can't be a deal with your party.
No, I think what the rejection was something about an electoral pact. Well, given that I never made the proposal in the first place, that was an overwrite in a Sunday newspaper. We're not particularly bothered by that. What Ash Regan will be taking is measures how we can re-emphasise independence as the priority of the Scottish Government. That's what both Alba and the SNP should be interested in. How we can move away from the identity agenda that's taken up so much bandwidth of the Scottish Government, and also how we can return to what, let's call it, the people's agenda of education, health, housing, and above all, jobs and industry. And Ash Regan has some proposals on how to do that. So these are very reasonable proposals, and let's hope that Humza Yousaf gives it a receptive hearing.
Well, his colleague Ian Blackford, as I said, has been pretty clear this morning that Humza Yousaf is not going to be picking up the phone to you anytime soon. But would anything actually be a red line? You know, you said the idea of a pact, well, that's not really a big deal. But would there have to be a promise of concrete moves towards another independence referendum or new laws on that?
Well, the specific proposals that Ash Regan has, she has a bill in the Scottish Parliament to extend the powers of the Parliament to include the legislation for negotiation of independence. We've got every reason to believe that's within the competence of the Parliament, and we'd like a discussion around that. And secondly, of course, there's the idea of an independence convention, something that's been widely canvassed by the independence movement and could put independence back into the front pages and top of the list of priorities of the Scottish Government. Now, all independence supporters should want to see that, whether they're in Alba or in the SNP, which is why I describe Ash Regan's ideas as extremely reasonable proposals.
Have there actually been any talks, though, between the SNP and Ash Regan or anyone from your party so far?
Well, the key talks are going to be between Ash Regan and Humza Yousaf in the next couple of days. He's written her an invitation. She has replied, unlike the Liberal Democrats, she's replied politely and in the affirmative. And it'll be out of these key talks we'll decide the outcome of next week. Now, we're hoping for a positive outcome, at least I am. That's why we're putting forward constructive proposals. We have obviously to prepare that things don't work out, in which case there could be an election in Scotland. There are other possibilities as well. And that's why the Alba executive are meeting this afternoon to prepare for an election, just in case the there's not a positive outcome of the talks.
But as a backer of independence, you've devoted so much of your life to it. Would you really act to sink an SNP government? Isn't perhaps what's going on here that you, as the leader of a tiny party that didn't win any seats in 2021, are actually just enjoying this moment rather a lot, and that's what it's about?
Well, Alapa are going to win seats at the next Scottish election, whenever it is. A very interesting poll showed in terms of preference for First Minister, Alapa at 15% across Scotland, and leading actually here in the northeast of Scotland. And as you know, the arithmetic in the Scottish Parliament system, that would give Alapa around 20 seats in the Scottish Parliament. But, you know, we've got to also think what's in the interests of Scotland. And what's in the interest of Scotland just now, in my estimation, is to get independence back to the top of the political agenda, to move away from the culture wars, identity politics that are so divisive in Scottish society, and to get the Scottish Parliament onto, let's call it the people's agenda, of jobs, housing, health, education, and above all, investment in key Scottish industries in the energy sector. Okay. That's the proposals that Ash Regan will be taking to the First Minister. OK, we'll see what the outcome of all of that is. Alex Salmon, thank you for bearing with the Aberdeenshire rain. It's been great to have you on the programme, and we'll follow with interest what happens in the next couple of days. Now, it's not just a busy election year for us here with all sorts of shenanigans going on. In America, Joe Biden and Donald Trump are slugging it out in what might just be one of the most consequential White House races in history, with Trump in court and Biden under fire from students protesting against what's happening in Gaza right across the US. Well, I've been speaking to one of President Biden's closest allies and most prominent Democrats, the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
There's complete justification for speaking out against what is happening there. What's happening in Gaza, it just challenges the conscience of the world. The starvation, the dehydration, the malnutrition, and now rising in some parts of Gaza, famine that almost is unforgivable in terms of the toll it takes on children. In our country, though, we would like to see some of that enthusiasm recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization that did a barbaric thing in Israel on October 7th. Israel has a right to defend itself. The manner in which they are doing it is really challenging, because Netanyahu, who's never been an agent for peace, I'm not a big fan of his, but he couldn't have done things worse than tens of thousands, whatever the figure may be, of people dying, children malnourished, and the uncertainty that is there. And that's what people are speaking out about.
But do you understand why young people are protesting in such a way? Are the tactics being used on campuses the right ones?
When they go beyond campuses and block the Golden Gate Bridge or something for a long period of time, and people can't go to the doctor or the hospital or to whatever is urgent in their lives, it doesn't win favor. It doesn't win favor. It may attract press, but it does not attract favor. I mean, how can you ever criticize demonstrations on campuses? That's a way of life for us in America.
There is so much at stake right now, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in terms of what's going on in Ukraine. And you talk very passionately about the need to defend democracy. One of the things you've argued very strongly for is against the social media platform TikTok. The US is now taking strong action against that. But what do you think is the answer to the problem of democracy being under such strain?
Well, I think that the TikTok issue was a security issue. And it got the biggest vote of any of the votes on Saturday, 380 votes in the bill that had that in there to entice people to their point of view. But the most important thing we can do is to support the people in Ukraine who are fighting for their democracy, and in doing so, for democracy writ large. What we have to do in the United States is win the election. We win the election because there are elements on the other side that are undermining principles of democracy in our own country and not supportive of democracy elsewhere.
Yet what concerns Americans most is inflation, job creation, and immigration. And when you look at the polling, former President Trump leads President Biden in those three categories very significantly. So are voters wrong If the current president's record is so good, why aren't people convinced?
Well, the polls may be wrong. Why are we identifying people with the polls? That the polls were wrong in the last election. They said we're going to lose 30 or 40 seats in the congressional races. We lost 5 in New York, and we'll win them back. Joe Biden will win. His numbers are improving, if polls mean that much. His numbers are improving. But the thing is that elections are campaigns. That's a war term, and that's what we're in. We decide to win. We make every decision in favor of winning. We marshal our forces, our strength, and that's all going very well for us. So I do think that we could do better in convincing people that what Joe Biden did in creating 9 million jobs, as opposed to a former president who lost more jobs than any president in history, was to make that message clear.
But this election does feel very much in the balance. You say for the sake of democracy, you have to win.
And we will.
But many people seem ready to turn to Donald Trump again because they don't feel they have a good alternative. And there are plenty of loyal Democrat voters and many undecideds who aren't convinced by President Biden.
In terms of democracy, of course, that's related, but it's not central to it, except if, depending on what the Chinese government is doing with the algorithms and the rest of that.
Whether that's because of his gaffes, or whether that's because of his age, or whether that's because of his visible frailty, Democrats sometimes worry that he's not a commander-in-chief in a time of war and real threats. What do you say to that?
I see it differently. I see a president who has a vision for America that is a great one, is strong. I see a president who knows, because he's been there, has the experience, gained the wisdom from his age and being there, that he knows what will work, and he knows how to do it because he's been a legislator a long time. And most importantly, what's in his heart for the American people, more empathy than you can name. And that has to come across in the elections.
You don't think then his visible frailty is an issue? You don't think it's a problem?
I don't get the point. This is a great American president. He's younger than I am, so I don't know what the point is about age.
It's a question about frailty, though, isn't it? There's never a question about whether Janet Yellen's too old for the job, or there's not. It doesn't seem to be a question about President Trump's age. People often look at President Biden and they wonder about his frailty. But I know that you know him well.
Well,
does it make him cross?
They're voting for him in the election. When people see him, they come back and they say, why do people say that about him? He has humor and vitality and knowledge and recognition. I had somebody ask me about him, and I said, we just had him in San Francisco for an event. He gave a fabulous presentation, no notes. He met the people in the photo line and then saw them at the table and remembered them. No name tags. And he was funny, no kidding.
During the years of President Trump, politics in America became more and more toxic, it seemed, almost every day. You were called Crazy Nancy repeatedly. Your own husband was attacked during that period by someone who demonized you. Do you have fear of a Donald Trump return to the White House?
Yes, for many reasons. Political, policy, personally for many people, because he's out to get. But you said they called me crazy. Understand this about the other guy. He's a master of projection. He called Hillary Crooked Hilton. Hillary, he's got how many? 96 felony charges. He calls Joe Sleepy Joe. He's asleep in court in his own trial. He calls me Crazy Nancy, and he's crazier than you would ever want to know as somebody who had been president of the United States. But the beat goes on. Every time he calls somebody something, you know he recognizes what he is, and he thinks that's a weakness, so he'll project it on somebody else. So when you said that guy attacked my husband, demonized me, no, the Republican Party demonized me. Donald Trump demonized me.
But being here, having a conversation about defending democracy, though, do you think voters are wrong if they find President Trump an appealing prospect? Are voters wrong if they want to vote for him again? Are they wrong if they want to vote for the Republican Party in 2024?
Well, it's not a question of whether they're wrong. We just disagree. It's interesting. He exploited the populism message and then went into the office and passed one bill giving 83% of the benefit, a tax bill that gave 83% of the benefits to the top 1%, adding $2 trillion to the national debt, and then complaining if we want to feed the children.
His role abroad, though, two of our former Prime Ministers, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, have both said the world was safer under Donald Trump. What do you say to them?
I don't know what they're talking about, and it may be in their interest to talk about that. I didn't know they said that, and I'm sorry they did. Because safer for what? Safer for billionaires not to have to pay taxes, safer people who dislike people of color and LGBTQ and women in a rising situation. Safer for what? Safer for white men? Safer for white people? What was it safer for? I came from Baltimore. A national anthem was written there, and my favorite line in it is, "Proof through the night that our flag was still there." And that flag is our symbol of democracy, with liberty and justice for all. Not for tax breaks for the wealthiest people in America or discrimination against people of color. Liberty and justice for all.
Nancy Pelosi, one of the most prominent Democrats in the land. Now, we've had such a busy morning and we have not much time for the end. Sometimes we have a nice chat, but I'm going to ask you all a specific question. So, Ian, firstly to you, will Humza Yousaf be First Minister in Scotland by the end of the week?
I believe he will. I would say to all party leaders, go and talk to Humza. Let's see where we can build consensus. Let's make sure that that government can do its job, and we'll go through to 2026.
As long as it's not Alex Salmond, because you said that's not happening.
What we have said is that our door is open to the leaders of all the political parties in the Scottish Parliament. Alex Salmond will not be at that table.
OK, Shami, are you feeling that the election is about to be called, or that Westminster's just like going round and round chasing its tail, getting excited about a summer election?
Chasing its tail.
And Robert, this time next week, the Conservatives are expected to have a very hard time at the local elections. Do you think that there will be a challenge to Rishi Sunak?
No, I don't. I don't think this is about personalities. It's about policy. It's about delivering for the public. I think the party needs better answers to the challenges facing the country. And one of those, as we've discussed this morning, is on migration. I think the single best thing that the party could do after those elections is to have a stronger, clearer message to our voters, to people who voted for Brexit and want to see us controlling and reducing migration. And I've produced a plan that could help with that.
Of the Court of Human Rights.
Well, as we
Trump style.
We opened the programme with an eye roll from Wes Streeting, and you were rolling your eyes then, Shami. Why?
Because just as we heard from Nancy Pelosi, democracy and the rule of law is under threat all over the world. And it is not the time for great democracies like the UK and the US to be looking inwards instead of outwards to preserve rights, freedoms, the rule of law and democracy internationally. OK, well,
we've talked about lots of really big ideas this morning. It's been great to have the three of you with us. Thank you for your time. A huge thank you to my trio, and a huge thank you to you for watching at home. Normally, when we say goodbye, I try to take an educated guess, supposedly, at what the next week might bring. But with so much going on, I might not hazard that. Instead, please do join me on Thursday for the overnight election results, and I'll see you back here next Sunday when there might just be a new First Minister in Scotland. There will probably be hundreds of new councillors across England, and it is not impossible that there could be a challenge to the Prime Minister from some concerned Conservative MPs. I couldn't help myself but do some speculating after all. Look forward to seeing you next Sunday, same time, same place.
I don't know about that. She's doing the fucking election. I have to put it with her fucking face on Thursday. Jesus fucking Christ. Alright, I'll do you some predictions. The Tories going to get their ass whooped. Big time. Apparently it's supposed to be like 400 seats. Or some shit. Anyway, they're going to get smashed. I think the Lib Dems and the Greens are going to do actually quite good. Reform might do quite well. Tories are going to get their ass kicked. That's all I know. Even Tories don't like Tories at this point, which is quite funny to watch. But then again, that's what I'm saying. Britain is a weird place when it comes to elections. Like drinking cups of tea. They will stay in power for as long as people can be asked putting up with them. As soon as they fucking the public's done with them, they're just like, well, we're not voting for you anymore. Fuck off. So you lose elections in Britain. You don't technically win them. You lose them. It's quite funny. That's why they stay in power forever, because no one can be asked getting rid of them. Most of the time, anyway. The only reason why the Tories have been in power this long, no jokes, is Brexit. That's it. Like, literally, that's the only fucking way they've stayed in power for this fucking long, which is quite funny. But apart from that, SNP, they're going to get toasted. It's good timing, because if they do elections in Scotland, Labour gets seats. More chance of Labour doing well in the general election, because, like I said before, if you use the electoral map in Britain, or the UK mainland, you need fucking Labour seats in Scotland, or they're never going to fucking win. Unless it's like stupid majority time, or whatever. But you need Labour votes, basically, in Scotland, so that might work in Labour's favour, I suppose. But we'll see anyway. I'll do a long-ass Thursday stream. Now, I've got to be careful, because question time's on Thursday as well. Unless they ditch it, or put it on BBC Two, so we'll see. I mean, I might be able to get away with it, because the votes aren't coming, so fuck knows what time. It's normally in the morning anyway. So, we'll see. Anywho, hope you all enjoy the rest of your day and the weekend and whatever, and I will see you probably maybe Thursday. I don't know, if I stream, I'll stream, but you'll definitely see me Thursday for the elections. Anywho, stay safe and have a lovely day.